Hey folks, welcome to Narratives. Narratives is a podcast exploring the ways in which the world is better than in the past, the ways it is worse, and the paths towards a better, more definite vision of the future. I'm your host, Will Jarvis, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. I hope you enjoy it. You can find show notes, transcripts, and videos at narrativespodcast.com. Well, Delian, how are you doing this morning?
Doing good. Excited to chat today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show. I really appreciate it. Do you mind giving a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Sure. Sped up, version of my background. I was originally born in Bulgaria, moved out to the United States with my parents when I was, a kid. Kind of bounced around the United States. Eventually ended up at MIT thinking that I was going to become an academic. Instead, sort of took a hard left turn, and after sophomore year, ended up dropping out of school to make my way off to Silicon Valley. Founded my first company, which was like an enterprise healthcare company. Went through YC Summer 14 with it. Ran it for about 3.5, 4 years. We kind of got to ramen profitability, but sort of never grew fast enough to raise Series A. And then went off and became after shutting down the company, became the VP of growth at this company called Teespring, which is another YC company. And then ended up switching over to the investor side of things. I've been an investor now for about 5 years or so. First 2 years of that over at Khosla Ventures with Vinod Khosla, and then the last 3 years or so over here at Founders Fund, and mostly focused in those 5 years on investing in sort of seed, Series A, and mostly in what I call sort of just anything but boring software. So no consumer social, no enterprise SaaS, nothing like that, but everything from like regulated industries like healthcare tech, fintech, insurtech. As well as a lot in the world of deep tech, hardware. So everything from like aerospace, industrial automation, robotics, home construction. I think, one of the things that I really, in some ways, like about venture is that it's one of the, few jobs where as an adult, you actually still get paid to, continue to learn. And so, over the course of, my time in venture, I've gotten to, dive into a variety of different, fascinating areas. I think partially from spending some time with, one of my primary mentors, Keith Raboy, who's also on the board of, or is one of the founders of Open Door. Learned a lot about sort of the real estate industry, and in particular, was just like fascinated with how inefficient like single family home construction was. And so, a couple of years back, I was fascinated with the idea of why is sort of, why are single family homes inflationary? But if you look at almost every other consumer good, they're extremely deflationary, right? Phones, TVs, et cetera. And most of the reason being that most of the things that are deflationary have largely been produced on sort of automated, assembly lines. And so why hadn't anybody, taken that same approach and done it with homes? Turns out, homes have a lot more SKUs in them, so it's a little, more difficult. And, the thing is, a home is much more difficult to, deliver, fully finished. And so, in like an automotive line, when you're, assembling a car, there's a few different sort of like sub-assembly lines, and then there's, sort of the final assembly line known as like the general, assembly line. In homes, the general assembly line has to happen on site in the middle of, the outdoors, the wild, sort of conditions. Can't happen on a factory floor. And so there's a ton of different, difficulties that come with that. And so I ended up getting fascinated with that whole field, and then I got to invest in this company, Cover, which is based out in LA. And so it's been fun to, see that, as my, fascinations shift over time, I'm able to, then invest in the company and move on to the next fascination. So, right now I spend a lot of my time, in aerospace, trying to think about, okay, how do you sort of, take this infrastructure that, honestly, mostly Elon has built, and, that infrastructure being the equivalent of, AWS in 2008. And, now you've got this great infrastructure, so you don't have to build your own data centers. What are the interesting, applications you can do on top of it when you don't have to build your own data center, i.e. your own rocket? And so working on that myself, in the space manufacturing world at Varda, but then, also excited to be investing in companies like Hadrian, Impulse Space, other people sort of building on top of that, infrastructure to, provide those next generation use cases. One of the other areas that I'm particularly fascinated by right now, in particular because I'm sort of in the thick of it, myself, is the world of sort of like IVF, fertility, surrogacy, how to sort of encourage, the replacement rate of, Western countries not being below 2. Right now the, average, child rearing rate in the United States is actually below, our death rate. And so really fascinated by, the various companies that are working on trying to, make that, easier. Everything from, obviously post child being born and, the homeschooling world, all the way back to, embryonic, sequencing, polygenic risk scoring, surrogacy, brokers, IVF, facilities. And so that's one area that I'm spending a decent amount of time on. So yeah, I'd say multivaried, interests and areas that I like, diving into, but I like the things that are, sort of the things that actually, shape society, but are, super inefficient. And, right now, everything from, housing costs to, babies are probably the current fascinations.
That's great. That's great. I'm curious, how do you pick, problem areas to explore? Is it just you look at is it like a top-down approach where you look at the biggest problems facing humanity right now, like our like we're below replacement in the West, or like housing prices, just insane explosion in the price of housing in the US? Do you just see a problem and then go down and try and figure out why and where people are building solutions? Or is it just more ad hoc? You see a company, okay, like, wow, that's super interesting, let's go investigate, and then you go up to the broader problem?
Yeah, I think I tend to be more of like a bottoms up thinker than a tops down. I think there are people in the world, how people even at my firm, let's say like, I think the Peter Thiels of the world are very much top down, macro, under, sort of provide these, sort of general and overarching, frameworks on how to think about the world. And I think I take a very sort of opposite approach with just like how I get fascinated with problems and, where I, gravitate towards, in that, in the world of like, IVF, fertility, et cetera, is mostly just like myself going through the process as a user, is the fascination with, home construction. It was honestly just like, seeing, John Jaffe from Lennar. He's the president of Lennar, which is the largest home builder in the United States. And, him, talking about, how they construct homes, the difficulties of that. And then, I think it's, I sort of get these like, brainworms in my head where I'm like, oh, that's like super interesting. And then I end up spending like the next 3 weeks talking to every single like home building, expert, digging into, every single company. So I'd say it's a little bit more, bottoms up, ADD, curiosity. I can't just help but, scratch the itch. And sometimes I get an itch and it's like, it's not that interesting of a solution. And like, they're like, that interesting of a problem or something that can actually be fixed. And sometimes you ended up discovering like, oh my God, this is actually like a really big problem and people are kind of talking about it, but like, not nearly enough. So I'd say like, fertility is one of those things. It's been interesting to see, like, for example, like Elon has now tweeted, I think like twice in the past like 6 months about like, people needing to have more kids. So it does feel like it's starting to get a little bit more attention. But, even a year or two ago, it still felt like one of these topics that was, under discussed, i.e. the, sort of Western fertility rate.
Absolutely. And it seems like, there are a lot of problems like this that just go completely unnoticed in society. I just had an academic on from AEI yesterday who works on this crazy fact that 7 million US American men don't have a job, aren't in education, aren't doing anything. And it's just like completely ignored. Like no one's talking about this, like this huge like problem. I'm curious, how do you get up to speed in an area? Do you have like a systemic process where you like call an expert first and then you like, or is it just like trying to do research on the internet in the beginning and then it's finding experts, or is it just kind of completely ad hoc and it just depends?
Yeah, I think, I don't have an infinite set of data points on how I've succeeded in doing this. Aerospace probably being the only one thus far where I comfortably say that I have a very good understanding of the entire sort of aerospace industry ecosystem. What the upcoming business models are, and if I sort of reverse engineer how I came about it, it was mostly just like spending lots of time with smart people in person, right? I think, there was some amount of like, reading online or, some amount of like, textbooks, but like that was not where the majority of the interesting insights came from. It was ultimately just like going to a lot of aerospace conferences, practically reaching out to and speaking to a lot of different like aerospace CEOs, and just like spending time around people that had, thought really, deeply, about the industry. And it's fascinating sometimes how like even people within the industry don't take the time to survey their own industry, right? I think it was surprising to me that like very rapidly I became more well networked in aerospace than people that were even like working very practically in aerospace, because it just wasn't their core focus. Their core focus was just like execution, versus I was like very proactively, going out to, try and, sort of meet everyone, learn about their, philosophies, how they thought about, the industry. And eventually you end up like amalgamating a sort of higher level view where you've kind of, seen everybody in it. And so, I'm pretty, obsessive with the fact that, right now, I'm diving into, some of these new areas around IVF, fertility, life sciences. And like my first thing is just like, okay, who are the experts that I can talk to? What are the conferences that I can go to, and just like, start to inundate myself and learn, via osmosis. So I think I'm much more of a, I don't know what the, right thing is, is it verbal, is it visual, et cetera, learner. I'm like visual osmosis learner. Like, the way that I learn the best is like having an expert walk me through their paper. Like I can go read the paper and yes, I'll like, absorb it some amount, but being able to like live Q&A, like basically like, with the, author is always much more fascinating. And I think people underappreciate if you just like have a like, very inquisitive mind and, clearly written sort of cold email that explains why you're excited to chat with them, almost anybody in the world will like, hop on the phone with you and, walk you through, what they're up to. Cause they're just like, so like, people love explaining their work, right? This maybe being a perfect example, right? I'm always, happy to hop on a podcast and explain what I'm up to. Turns out, even the, top IVF researcher in the world is happy, to do the same because people very rarely are, interested and, curious about their work and, dig up, their papers.
That's great. That's great, and that is my motivation for starting the podcast in the beginning. I'm curious. Does that experience make you bearish on remote?
Oh yeah, extremely so. I mean, I think it's just hard. Some of these conversations require some level of like meandering, where and just like spontaneous connections. And I think it's just really hard. Like if I were to recreate that aerospace thing, aerospace, let's say like osmosis period, and I did it entirely remotely, it's just not the same. It feels so much more artificial. Where it's like, hey, I would like to like hop on a like 30-minute Zoom call with you, but then the Zoom call like needs to have a particular topic or something versus like just sitting down at a conference and like grabbing lunch and then this person comes over and then this person comes over and you just kind of absorb and listen. I think it's just like really really hard to create that sort of experience. That's actually why I think in particular the like world of remote actually hampers people earlier in their career the most, because like if you're sort of mid-stage and you're like a VP of product at like XYZ company, at that point like you may not be actually interested in like building up your skill set anymore. You're just like pure execution mode. And so yeah, it's great for like the VP of product that's 32, married, has 2 kids, like remote. I totally understand why somebody like that would absolutely love remote. But like the hyper ambitious 24-year-old that like really wants to learn from them, man, it kind of sucks reporting to that VP of product because like you don't get as much of the spontaneous interaction. And if you're the hyper curious, whatever, 20, whatever I am, 9-year-old or 8, I don't remember how old I am, 28-year-old, venture capitalist that wants to, keep learning via these types of, spontaneous osmosis interactions. I think it's tough to do that, remotely. To speak of the devil, I'm, in an in-person office right now at Ramp, in New York. And surrounded by a bunch of, 20, my brother's 21 to, 28-year-old hyper ambitious software engineers, product managers, product operations folks that are just outside of this office. And, I can tell you these folks are moving a lot faster and learning a lot more than people that are trying to do the same thing over Zoom.
Definitely. Well, it absolutely seems like there's a lot of legibility problems, right? Like the problems you're working on often are difficult to describe and much easier to kind of understand in person, it seems like.
Yeah.
I'm curious, with Varda, was it a top-down approach or was it like, I want to build a company, a space company, and then I'm going to go out and figure out what's the best problem I can solve? Or was it, I know manufacturing space is this huge $20 bill on the sidewalk. I just need to go vet that idea.
No, yeah, it was very much, the latter. And it wasn't even like, let's say, like a vetting of the idea. I'd been thinking of the idea for like almost a decade before pulling the trigger on it. It was actually, in Q4 2019, Q1 20, before even starting Varda, I was, so convinced that there was an opportunity here that I actually spent most of those 2 quarters talking to everybody that was working, on the problem. And there were a variety of different sort of like what I'd call more academic type groups that had been either publishing papers on it, doing small scale experiments on the ISS. And I was actually hoping to invest in one of those groups and ideally help them scale their work beyond the ISS in a much more sort of, commercial, venture scalable, fashion. But, unfortunately, just like could not, find a team that I was excited by / a team that was excited to actually take that sort of ambitious, more risky approach of moving off of the ISS and potentially not necessarily just relying, on NASA, for funding. And so I actually originally put the idea back on the shelf once COVID hit. And then, as we were sort of in the summer post-COVID, summer 2020, was realizing, man, I still am like really excited about this idea. And, I honestly I had zero interest in starting a company again. Like I had a lot of, PTSD and frustrations from my, first go around, realizing that, maybe I wasn't the best suited to be the CEO of a company. And so at the end of the thing, it was extreme, it was definitely not like I want to start a company and let me go figure out what to work on. It was more like, man, I'm so obsessed with this idea and it bugs me that nobody's doing it correctly. And like, fuck, the one thing in the world that I really don't want to do is start a company. But like, if this is the only way to solve it, then like, maybe I will. But only if I like put together the perfect founding team, the perfect financing and cap table, and like have it ready to go. And I remember thinking at the beginning of the summer, like, June, July 2020, I was like, there's just no way that like I line all these things up. Like it's COVID, it's gonna be impossible to do this. And then by like, December, I had the perfect founding team. I had the perfect, financing lined up, et cetera. And I just remember thinking, I was like, it feels like I am like looking down the double barrel of a shotgun, and I know how painful it is to blow my brains out because I've blown my brains out before. And yet again, I'm choosing to pull the trigger. And so, yeah, here I am, a year and a half later with my brain splattered against the wall. And I'm like, why the fuck did I do it? But, some problems are worth splatting your brain against the wall for.
Absolutely, absolutely, they are. Do you think on the margin more founders should wait until it's like, man, like, God, like I just have to do this instead of like trying to put a square peg in a round hole?
Yeah, I mean, this is the classic feedback that I give, especially to like younger founders that are like, I've got they have this like, and I had this too. I had this like mental image of like, oh, I need to be a founder because of like the like status or respect or like the access that you got to certain individuals or being able to like talk about the fact that you fundraised. And it's just like, that was partially why my first company failed. Is it was like ultimately a problem that I wasn't sort of deeply, passionate about. And that was sort of the promise that I made to myself after my first company was, the only, if I were to ever do this again in the future, it needs to be a problem that is like so brainwormed in my head that I know that no matter what happens, if you chop my like, feet off, if you make it so that like, I have to spend every damn dollar in my bank account, I'm going to care about this problem so much that I will like still do it. And for a long time, I thought I was like, it's no such problem exists. You know what I mean? But it was that like exploration of space manufacturing as an investment thesis and then noodling on it over the summer. And I remember there's actually, funnily enough, the way that it sort of transitioned from, idea in my head to, oh, fuck, I might need to start a company to do this it was actually like probably like May or June 2020. And I can like dig up the tweet, but it was effectively like, drawing this correlation between like, the government is printing shit tons of money. That means, interest rates are going like, crazy, crazy low. Cost of capital is effectively, zero. Now is probably the best time in human history, effectively, to like start a deeply, capital intensive, deep tech, company, especially in aerospace. I remember like I tweeted that and I was like, fuck, like, I gotta, go do this idea. Cause like, it's both like the right time to do the idea. Cause like Falcon 9 is reusable and Starship is coming online and like the capital environments are like perfect right now to basically like start this type of idea. So yeah, I think more founders should take this approach of like, you should be like, begging yourself to like find a solution to the problem that you want to solve that isn't starting a company. And if and only if the only way to solve that problem is to like start a company, then one should do it. The people that take this approach of like, oh man, I got to start a company for starting a company's sake, those people all end up like, depressed 3 years in because it's like, even if your company's like successful, you're working on like some boring enterprise SaaS thing that you can give like zero shits about. The problem is like the moment that you hit any single moment of like adversity, you just, surrender at the first, fire from the enemy. And so, yeah, there's just so many examples of this of just like, even if the first 3 years, 4 years are easy because you chose the like hot new Web3 SaaS, social, blah, blah, blah. No company is like smooth sailing all the way through. And so then you're, Ryan Breslow, quitting at the 12 billion, valuation just when the going gets tough. And like, that's not what ends up, making you a, top tier entrepreneur in the long term. You gotta stick it out.
Absolutely.
And it's only fun to stick it out if it's a problem you really believe in.
That's right. That's great. I'm curious, what do you see as the biggest bottleneck? You work in venture, so you get a good view on this. What's the biggest bottleneck to getting more breakout companies? Is it, capital? Is it like smart founders working on the right problems? Like what's your sense of that?
I actually believe, and I think this was Sam Altman that's tweeting about this a lot lately, but I'd have to, go back and look. But it's basically just like a lack of like people who have been trained with high agency. Like, I think, there's a significant underappreciation by, call it with some level of like intellect, network, access to capital, et cetera, underappreciation of like how much agency that gives you in the ability to like manipulate the world to the future that you want to, see. And I think that's what's mostly lacking. Like, it's not for a lack of like Stanford educated computer science grads. There's like a semi-infinite number of those. I could probably throw a dart, off like this office building here, and I'd probably hit a Stanford CS grad. So it's definitely not a lack of that. It's definitely not a lack of capital. There's still like, even with, the current, public markets, there's still like semi-infinite capital if you have like, the right ideas. And so, I think it mostly comes to just like this like sense of, agency of, tackling, a hyper ambitious problem with just like the, right, skill set, founding team approach. That to me is like sort of like the lacking founder is the lacking factor, is these like, sort of high, agency, founders that are, tackling something, sort of truly, truly ambitious, not, an incremental, whatever SaaS for, plumbers type thing.
And do you think that's something we can perhaps modify, like, encourage people to have more agency, give them some kind of hero license? Because you found one, right, with Varda. So maybe there's some process, or maybe this could just be inbuilt. You could just you'd be a high agency person or something.
Yeah, I don't think that I had some sort of natural predisposition to agency. I do think that this was something that was either coached into me, encouraged into me, or just the fact that I got to spend time early in my career with very high agency people. I think. And I don't know what the right way to scale that approach is, because by default the whole point of this is that there's a lack or a scarcity in high agency people, and so if the only way to scale it is osmosis with other high agency people, then obviously it's a relatively limited function. But as an example, I kind of skimmed over this in my original sort of bio introduction. But actually, my very first job in Silicon Valley was the summer of 2012, being an intern at Square. And part of why I even prioritized Square was it's not that I was particularly passionate about mobile payments for cafes. I was particularly passionate about just working with Jack Dorsey. And this was in 2012, before Jack is who Jack is today. Back then it was clear that he was a top tier entrepreneur, but a much more controversial figure. But I was just so fascinated by the idea of I wanted to work with somebody like him, right? And at the time there wasn't Elon was still under the radar a bit, / maybe I just wasn't as fascinated with him at the time, but I was I want to work with this magnetic, clearly super high agency individual. And so I guess I was, attracted to agency. And so maybe the way that we would scale it is making, if anything, maybe people criticize the glorification of founders in today's day and age. And I do agree that it's okay, yeah, maybe people over glorify the Dom Hollands of the world that are phenomenal fundraisers, but, I wouldn't, necessarily say they're phenomenal, operators. How do you maybe make it so that young people glorify high agency people? That would be the way to scale it up, because then more of them will want to go work near those high agency people, and then they themselves will become high agency via osmosis. But I think a alternate path down that maybe was just as smart, had just as much access to capital, was still in Silicon Valley, but was not exposed to Jack Dorsey, and then Keith Raboy, and then, Sam Altman, et cetera. These people that I would describe as super high agency people that were extremely influential, all three of them in my career from ages literally I was working at Square when I had just barely turned 18. I was 18 in 5 months or whatever, right? Old, all the way through to, starting Varda at age, whatever, roughly, 26 and a half. Those 8 years, I had semi-constant exposure, to those, three, individuals, all of whom I would describe as extremely high agency. And so when you have these, sort of mentors that you clearly see are able to will something into the world, right? Maybe, Keith being obviously my, closest mentor, I, got to know him basically summer of 2012 when I was working at Square and he was the COO. When I was an intern at Square and he was the COO at Square. And so I got to know him from literally the ideation moment of Open Door through now, obviously, Open Door being a, in my opinion, very successful, public company. I think maybe underappreciated by the public markets, but I think that will shift over time. And that was literally just completely there was no happenstance. There was no oh, these two founders accidentally met, et cetera. It was no, he literally was this is the thing. I need to construct this, into, existence, and, literally will it into existence and force it into existence when it may not have there's zero chance that it would have existed or succeeded otherwise. It's not there were other people working on things Open Door when, Open Door, came together. And so you see that and you're okay, I could, I think I could do that. It's not easy, for sure. But follow the formula. It's just yeah, truly believe in an idea. Think about what the ideal founding team needs to be. Hunt those people down. Convince them that they should, work on this. Keith spent, almost I think 4 or 5 years sort of, one, he worked on the original idea of Open Door in 2003 called Home Run, realized at the time the cost of capital was too expensive, couldn't actually approach it. But then even the ultimate CEO of Open Door, Eric Wu, he'd actually tried to recruit for the CEO of Open Door role 3 or 4 years prior. And didn't actually succeed. And then it was only the second time around of recruiting Eric that he actually managed to convince him to work on Open Doors. So it was one of these things that he clearly just persisted on just trying to will it into reality. And so it's when you experience that up front and up close, you're just it is very possible to will things into the world through like, again, sheer, sort of willpower. And so that just made me very convinced that I was like, I can do the same thing with Varda. I'm going to like will this into existence, and it's going to be, painful and take a lot of effort. I'm going to have to like, hunt down the exact right people, but it is definitely like, not impossible. Anyways, very long-winded answer to, I think osmosis to other high agency people is probably the right way to convince the youngins that they can do the same.
So perhaps, difficult to solve it at the macro level, at the micro level in your career, if you're a young person, should you try and select, the people you're going to work for agency, less than trying to select, whether this company is going to be successful in the long term? Do you think that's kind of an easier metric to select on?
Yeah, I think I think if there's one, mistake that I sometimes see people make early in their, career is that they like over optimize, for what is sort of the hot new thing or the status, et cetera, as opposed to, I think, what I would generally optimize for, which is just like osmosis from high agency, highly successful people. Because like, as an example, like the first 2 years or so of like working closely with Keith, not in like the square days or when I was running my own company, but when I actually originally joined Coastal Ventures as chief of staff, were not a particularly like high status role. Like, the thing that I, was joking about with like a founder the other day is like, parts of that role were very fun of like, getting to observe, Max Levchin at a firm board meetings. Now, again, I was a fly on the wall, but like getting to observe that was like such a like, honor in some ways, like the greatest entrepreneur of our, time. And I got to watch like how he was running his company. But like the less glorious aspects of it, like I had to fucking, deliver the, Diet Coke during those board meetings too. So it's like, is the like person that's like formerly the founder up on like, YC demo day. And now all of a sudden you got to deliver the goddamn, Diet Coke. Sometimes I think it's like you got to a little bit, sacrifice the ego, in exchange for, the, osmosis. And so I think that's the mistake that sometimes people make is they like, and I was there. I mean, like I was the like YC Teal Fellow founder, dropout, had extreme ego at age, 18 through, 21. And then, at some point, I wish I had been, self-aware enough that I was like, practically sacrificing it, but it was more that just like I fucked up so badly that I was like, well, clearly I probably shouldn't have much of an ego given that my, company failed.
Good stuff. So that's very practical advice. It's like, go find the high agency people, do what you can to work for them, help in whatever way you can, and then go from there. Good stuff. This is a bit of a left-hand turn, but I'm curious at the macro level, do you think venture, when you make a venture investment, how much are you thinking about future fundability? So like, to what extent is venture like a Keynesian beauty contest where you have to worry about, not only like, can these people build this and will the market buy it, but will future funders be able to like provide capital to this, or is it just too weird that they won't do it? And I'm sure like with some of your work, like with IVF, artificial wombs, et cetera, they may fall in these kind of categories.
Yeah, a couple different frames that you can take to answering that question. One of the things that we definitely think about at Founders Fund and is like and sometimes primary question that we ask when investing in a company is why will we uniquely appreciate this and almost every other investor will not, right? It's a maybe more specific way of asking the like how is this contrarian effectively question.
Yeah.
Now, however, the critical part of that is that eventually, for a company to be successful, it must transition from contrarian, to consensus, from when it transitions from an early stage to a late stage company, right? And that is the only way to be successful, right? So every successful company at the late stage is a consensus late stage successful company.
Right.
Where the most returns are made are contrarian early stage, companies. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that consensus early stage companies can't be successful too. There are plenty of examples in Silicon Valley where a company was effectively consensus from like the earliest stages all the way through. It's just hard to make as many returns on those because typically that means that it's like, highly competitive, even, from the, earliest, financing rounds. So is it something that, you need to think about? Absolutely. Because if it is, contrarian enough that it can never get, sort of future, financing, then it can never become the consensus, late stage company.
Right.
So it's something that, I absolutely, think about in, practice. Let's say, for myself for the last 2 years, I've tried to take a little bit of like the two ends of the barbell, curve approach, to investing that I think is at least, so far, we'll see. Maybe this is me being a bit naive into the early days of a potential downturn. But over the past few years, I've sort of taken, two ends of the bell curve approach. On one end, I've done the like highly speculative, moonshot, deep tech, but largely focused on like, aerospace type of investing, right? Probably, the biggest, sort of two positions being like Varda, Hadrian as examples. Right now in this like, current, recessionary, environment, they're actually still largely experiencing, tailwinds, partially because we're going through, expanding defense budgets, the Ukraine-Russia situation, and a lot of the, customers for those two companies being in DoD, aerospace, et cetera, is largely, being fine. So when I thought about those companies, the downstream investors, I was like, okay, these are things where like the downstream investors, I think, will appreciate these companies because the like, customers that they will be after will be, relatively, will have relatively larger budgets actually than expected. And then on the flip side, I invested in a bunch of companies that just had like great financials, even if they like on the surface kind of had warts because they had like some hardware or some regulation or it was like something that like investors wouldn't appreciate and in the early stages. But as the company got later, if you just examine the financial profile, they were quite attractive. And so there's a handful of I'd say 2 to 3 sort of Series A's that I did sort of last year. The two that are at least public are Stenin, this like soil analysis thing, and this company Lula, which is like this insurtech thing. Anyways, both having the first soil analysis having some interesting hardware and market dynamics. The second one having a little bit regulatory dynamics. But both of those are examples where it's like again, I think contrarian at the time in that people were like these companies do have revenue. Both companies were at like call it like 3 million of ARR, but we're now getting priced at whatever $1 billion post like everybody else was because they had these like warts on them. They were getting priced relatively reasonably, but now as they're getting later stage, people are just examining the financial profile. They're like, well, irrespective of the warts on them, look, they are like quite financially efficient. Versus I think where people got a little bit tripped up over the past year is like sort of funding these 100x 110x SaaS ARR businesses and not thinking through the downstream financing, i.e. okay, well at some point some investors are going to have to invest in this in the future, and are these 100x multiples going to sort of like last indefinitely? Probably not. And so, they're in a, sort of much, trickier spot with those investments in, those companies. And so, no, yeah, absolutely. There is a little bit of like a, whatever you want to call it, Russian doll effect of like, you absolutely need to be thinking through, what are the, downstream, financing risks. And I think, a lot of investors became particularly blind to that over the past 2 years, where there was this sort of assumption that like, in the past 2 years, if, you had a top tier fund lead your seed, it basically meant that you were like guaranteed that like another top tier fund would lead your Series A within like a year effectively. And so people started to ignore the potential, downstream, financing risks. So again, maybe I'm being, naive and, I'm going to have a bunch of failures in the, portfolio, but, at least so far, relative, to peers, I think partially because of the approach that I took over the last 2 years, I don't think the things that I've been working on have been, hit nearly as hard.
That's great. And going off this question, this is a little bit complicated, but do you think brand really matters in venture more than people realize? And does that explain, because it lets you worry less about future financing? In other words, and does this explain why top tier firms do a lot better than all the other firms? It is something like where, because, Founders Fund, you put in the seed round, Series A, they're like, well, that's a positive signal that this is probably a good investment. Does that make sense?
100%. These things are, venture is very much, the rich get richer, type of game. In that, even as an individual, like when you start off in investing, if you don't have a hit sort of in your first like 3 to 5 investments, it just gets really a lot more painful to actually ever get a hit in the future, because like you start to experience a lot of like molasses and difficulty. Both the firm that you're at will start to question each individual future investment more. Founders will be like less interested in working with you because it's like, well, there's no like positive signaling that comes with it, let alone like on the firm basis. And it's a combination of like a multitude of factors. It's not just that like future investors will be more interested and likely to invest in the company, but it's also literally that it allows the like founder to operate more successfully, because even candidates pay a lot more attention to it, right? Like the classic feedback that I always give to candidates that are on the market is like, don't try and choose which company is best, because like you're not a full-time investor, i.e. The goal of a should be optimizing ideally for upside in the company that you choose, but optimizing upside is kind of the investor's job in some ways, not you as the job market. It's the easiest way is just like choose what the sort of top tier investors are investing in and go work at one of those. Well, on the flip side, as a founder, that makes it so that if I take a top tier investor's capital, it makes it so that hiring is much easier. Hiring being much easier then allows me to execute much more easily. Executing much more easily then does allow for the downstream financing to be much easier. Now, should that be the case? Is that fair? Is that the way that the world should work? Doesn't fucking matter. Like that is just the way that the world works. And so I think it's one of those things that makes me very grateful to work at a place like Founders Fund, where the alternative or the parallel reality, where Delian was either a solo capitalist or working not at a Founders Fund, but still is interested in the same things, meeting with the same founders. It's one, not clear that like I would have been able to win the same deals. Two, it's not clear that those companies that I did invest in would be as successful because they would have lacked like the brand halo effect. And so I definitely am both very grateful to be working at a fund like Founders Fund, but also like I think a lot of people that are entering into the venture ecosystem appreciate the like benefit and advantage. I think a lot of people make the wrong call of if you have, let's say, an offer that is like an associate role at a tier 1 fund versus like a partner role at a tier 2 fund. If you actually are optimizing for like the long term of your venture career, it's pretty rare that like the partner role at the tier 2 fund is actually going to have the better outcome. It's not impossible, but you're just making life sort of much sort of more more difficult, because I think a lot of people do underappreciate this sort of like dynamics of the rich get richer in venture.
Absolutely. Is it your sense that founders underrate the value of brand from top tier ventures, or overrated, or just kind of properly rated at this point?
I think founders correctly rate it, but I think founders are unaware or have a little bit of a lagging sense of what the brands are. In that, like, as an investor on the inside, it's very clear which firms are performing, which are not, who is not, who is helpful, who is not, because we just have much more. We're in the market at all times, right? We are hearing about these rounds happening, this company exploding, this board member being a pain in the ass to work with, et cetera. So we have much more like perfect information. This stuff only makes it public sometimes a year and a half, 2 years later, when a firm prevents a top tier very public founder from like filing a sexual harassment claim against a board member, that sometimes only becomes public 2 years later, and then she tweets about it only 4 years later, versus when you're on the inside, you basically see it immediately. And so I think the only thing that founders sometimes lack is I've seen sometimes founders make a choice based off of relatively like lagging brand indicators. So I think rated appropriately, but maybe aren't as perfectly in tune. But that's just part of the market. Is reputation is very much a lagging indicator.
Got it. I've got one last big question for you here. And it's a big one. Do you think we'll be able to, escape decadence in the West, this kind of great stagnation, the fertility, the rising cost disease? I mean, like a lot of indicators look like really bad at this point. Do you think it's possible? If so, like what should are there any concrete policy proposals we should be thinking about more frequently?
Where is and who is John Galt? Good question. I think I'm actually relatively, optimistic about the, future of the West. I think partially the advantage in particular that the United States has, is that it is so much so a country that does not have a singular identity. Right. Like I think the reason why a Sweden or a Netherlands, et cetera, struggle to both innovate as much and potentially get sucked into this vortex of like, decadence and lack of, productivity and not really pushing the fold is because the identity is of like being a Swede. Right. That is the sort of national identity. Americans lack a national identity, which comes with in some ways a lot of, downsides of like you have these like, race wars, extremely divisive, Congress, to the point that like it is, sometimes, unproductive. Like it comes with tons of downsides. The flip side, though, is that there is sort of constant competition amongst various, geographies, ideologies, that allows for sort of like rise to the top of, the best, much more so than anywhere, else in the world. Yes, do healthcare costs, seem absolutely insane? Do education costs seem like they're, absolutely, going through the roof? Are taxes in California insane? Absolutely. All of those things are crazy. However, every single European, when they have a major health disorder, they fly to the United States for their healthcare. All of the top tier universities and the top tier research institutes are all in the United States: MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Caltech, et cetera. America is the only country that is currently flying and landing rockets in the entire world. And for all these things, you have the counterfactual of like, well, Florida has pretty damn low taxes, is pretty damn open, pro-capitalism, pro-growth. And that will eventually, cause some level of pressure. Like, as much as there's a little bit of this online meme of like Miami versus San Francisco, or is Miami going to be a tech ecosystem? It's like, in some ways, I think irrespective of which side you're on, you should, I think, be rooting for there just being more competition, such that, San Francisco politicians all of a sudden actually start to feel real pressure, where it's no longer just a guarantee that they're going to be the de facto, number one, tech hub in the United States. There's real alternatives that have very different policy approaches, and so I think there will be obvious ups and downs and difficulties, but in the grand scheme of life, I'm still very, very optimistic about the sort of rise of the West in the United States, maintaining dominance over the next century, irrespective of COVID, inflation, geriatric president, et cetera. I think we'll turn out just fine.
Excellent. Well, Delian, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where should we send people? Where can they find you?
Probably, the easiest is, if you're looking for, more info on Varda, it's varda.com, varda.com. Info on me is probably easiest found via Twitter, at Zebulgar, at Zebulgar.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Narratives.